In Chicago's towering financial district, 32-year-old Celeste Collins faced devastating news. Her stepfather had excluded her from his $2.3 million estate, leaving everything instead to his three real children. For over 2 decades, she had believed Sebastian Grant was nothing more than her devoted stepfather. But when she uncovered hidden medical files and DNA evidence, a shattering family truth emerged. What began as a desperate search for answers soon turned into an impossible choice between justice and love. The Grant family would never be the same once the truth revealed who truly belonged to whom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany conference table stretched between them like a chasm. Celeste Collins sat perfectly still, hands folded, watching Eleanor Grant's manicured fingers trace Sebastian's final will and testament. The law office smelled of leather and old money, the kind of place where fortunes were made and broken with a pen stroke. 3 days had passed since they'd buried Sebastian. 3 days since Celeste had stood graveside, watching dirt fall onto the coffin of the only father she'd ever known, while Miles, Evie, and Jonah accepted condolences as his real children. Now, in the sterile conference room light, that distinction was about to become devastatingly official. The last will and testament of Sebastian Marcus Grant, Eleanor began, her voice carrying 30 years of practiced authority, dated March 15th of this year. Celeste noticed how Eleanor's steel-gray eyes lingered on her longer than the others. There was something there. Sympathy, perhaps. Pity? As a social worker, Celeste had learned to read faces, to catch micro-expressions revealing what people truly felt beneath professional masks. Eleanor Grant was hiding something. "I leave the entirety of my business holdings, including Grant and Associates Consulting and all associated assets, to my eldest son, Miles Alexander Grant. This includes the family residence at 1247 Hillcrest Drive, along with all furnishings and personal effects." Miles straightened, satisfaction flashing across his features before composing himself into solemn duty. At 34, he had Sebastian's sharp jawline and confidence born from never doubting his place in the world. His Armani suit probably cost more than Celeste's monthly salary, but Miles had always lived in a different universe than the rest of them. "To my daughter, Evelyn Marie Grant, I leave $400,000 held in trust for her children's education and welfare, with additional provisions for her personal support." Evie's breath caught audibly. Tears filled her eyes. Relief, Celeste realized, not grief. The brutal divorce from Marcus had left Evie barely scrapping by on part-time jobs while caring for 8-year-old Sophie and 6-year-old Lucas. $400,000 meant college for her children, meant stopping 3 jobs and actually being present for their childhood. Celeste felt genuinely happy for her despite the growing knot in her stomach. Of all Sebastian's children, Evie had been kindest, including her in family gatherings, remembering her birthday when Sebastian forbout. "To my youngest son, Jonah David Grant, I leave $200,000, hoping he will pursue his artistic endeavors and find the peace that has long eluded him." Jonah's reaction was most complex. At 29, he still looked perpetually surprised by the world's cruelty. His dark hair was longer than Miles approved of, his vintage band t-shirt a deliberate middle finger to the formal atmosphere. But Celeste saw his trembling hands, the rapid blinking as he processed that Sebastian had finally acknowledged his music as more than a childish phase. Silence stretched. Celeste waited. Her professional training demanded calm until she had all information. But her heart hammered against her ribs, cold sweat breaking along her hairline. "That concludes the primary bequests." "What about Celeste?" Evie's voice cut through the room like a blade. Eleanor's eyes found Celeste's face again, sympathy unmistakable now. "Celeste Collins is mentioned once as a witness to Mr. Grant's signature on a 2019 power of attorney." The words hit like a physical blow. 21 years. She had lived in Sebastian's house for 21 years, from age 7 until college graduation. She had called him dad, sat at his table, gone to father-daughter dances where he'd awkwardly learned her taught steps. She had held his hand when Alice died, ensured he took blood pressure medication, spent countless evenings helping with business paperwork he claimed gave him headaches. And she was nothing but a witness signature. "That's not possible," Miles said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was looking at Celeste with that familiar expression, the look he'd given her at Christmas dinners and graduations, trying to figure out why an imposter sat at their table. "I'm afraid it is," Eleanor replied. "The will is comprehensive." Celeste forced herself to nod professionally. "I understand. Thank you, Mrs. Grant." Her voice came out steadier than expected. Eleanor's eyebrows raised in possible respect. Years of crisis counseling had taught compartmentalization, functioning when her world collapsed. She would process this later, alone. "Celeste, this isn't right," Evie said, tears flowing freely. "You're our sister, your family." "Half-sister," Miles corrected quietly. "Technically." "Don't." Dona's voice was sharp. "Just don't, Miles." Celeste stood, gathering her purse with barely shaking hands. "It's his decision to make. Was his decision." She looked around at these people she'd considered siblings for over 2 decades. "I hope you find happiness with your inheritance." She made it to the elevator before her composure cracked, made it to the parking garage before the first sob escaped. But reaching her 10-year-old Honda Civic, parked between Miles's BMW and Evie's aging minivan, the dam broke completely. She sat gasping between tears, trying to understand how Sebastian could have raised her, loved her. She thought he'd loved her, then erased her so completely from his final act. It wasn't about money, not entirely. It was about being seen, acknowledged, worthy of remembering. 21 years, and she'd been nothing but a witness. A tap on her window made her look up. Eleanor Grant stood beside her car, holding a manila folder and looking uncomfortable with her own kindness. Celeste rolled down the window, wiping her eyes hastily. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said simply. "I knew Sebastian for 25 years, handled all his legal affairs. This will surprised me." "Did he say why?" Eleanor hesitated, glancing toward the office building. "Sometimes families have secrets that complicate these matters. Sebastian was good, but complicated." She handed Celeste the folder. "Copies of everything. I thought you should have them." Celeste accepted the folder, feeling its weight. "Thank you. If you need anything, legal advice, someone to talk to, don't hesitate to call." Eleanor's voice carried an odd note, as if saying more than her words indicated. As Eleanor walked away, Celeste sat alone, holding papers that apparently represented her entire legal relationship with the man who raised her. But Eleanor's words echoed, "Families have secrets that complicate these matters." For the first time since hearing the will, Celeste felt something besides grief and betrayal. She felt curious. And in her social work experience, family secrets were never buried as deeply as people thought. The manila folder lay unopened on Celeste's coffee table for 2 weeks, like a sleeping animal she was afraid to wake. Every morning she'd see it there, nestled between unpaid bills and case files from work, and every morning she'd find an excuse to leave it alone. But the boxes Evie had quietly delivered 3 days ago, boxes labeled "For Celeste" in her careful handwriting, those demanded attention. "I saved what I could," Evie had whispered when she'd dropped them off, glancing nervously over her shoulder as if Miles might materialize to stalk her. "Things Dad didn't specifically mention in the will. Photos, some of Mom Alice's stuff. I thought you should have them." Now Celeste sat cross-legged on her apartment floor, surrounded by the detritus of a life she thought she understood. Her cramped studio apartment in southeast Portland felt even smaller with the boxes crowding the space between her secondhand couch and kitchenette.
The afternoon light filtered through rain-streaked windows, casting gray shadows across photographs that told a story she was only beginning to question. The first box held the expected treasures: school photos showing her gap-toothed smile at age 8, Mother's Day cards she'd made for Alice, a dried corsage from senior prom. But it was the second box that made her pause. These weren't her belongings, they were Alice's. Personal items that should have gone to Sebastian's bedroom or been distributed among his real children. Her fingers traced the edge of a small jewelry box, its velvet lining worn smooth. Inside, beneath a tangle of modest earrings and a wedding band, she found something that made her breath catch: a hospital bracelet. The plastic was yellowed with age, but the text was still legible. Alice Rivera, D.O.B., 04-15-1970, admit date 03-22-1996. March 1996. Celeste had been born in April 1996. She reached for her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard as she pulled up the family timeline she'd constructed years ago for a college sociology project about blended families. According to her research then, Alice had moved in with Sebastian in June 1996, 2 months after Lily's death, to help with the children during their grief. Alice and Sebastian had married in December of that same year. But if Alice had been admitted to the hospital in March, Celeste's hands were shaking now as she dug deeper into the box. Beneath Alice's modest jewelry, she found a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The return address made her stomach drop. Alice Rivera, with an address Celeste didn't recognize. The letters were addressed to Sebastian Grant at his home address. The postmark on the first letter, February 14th, 1996. Valentine's Day, 3 months before Lily's death. My dearest Sebastian, I know this is complicated, and I know we agreed to wait, but I can't stop thinking about Tuesday night, about the way you looked at me when you thought no one was watching. I see the guilt in your eyes, and I share it. Lily is so sick, and I'm supposed to be helping, not falling in love with her husband. But I can't help what I feel, and I hope you feel it too. All my love, Alice.
Celeste read the letter 3 times before its meaning fully penetrated. Alice hadn't moved in to help after Lily died. She had been there before, during Lily's illness. And she and Sebastian had been, what, having an affair? The second letter was dated March 10th, 1996. Sebastian, I need to see you. I have something to tell you, something that can't wait. I'm scared, and I don't know what to do. Can you meet me at our place tomorrow at 7? Please don't let this change everything. A. Our place? They had a place? While Lily was dying of cancer, Alice and Sebastian had a place where they met in secret. Celeste's professional mind kicked in, the same analytical thinking she used when untangling the complex family dynamics of her clients. She spread the letters chronologically across her coffee table, cross-referencing dates with the hospital bracelet. The timeline that emerged made her nauseous. March 1996, Alice's hospital admission, probably for prenatal care. Her letter to Sebastian about having something to tell him. April 1996, Celeste's birth. May 1996, Lily's death. June 1996, Alice officially moves in to help with the children. She was studying a photograph she'd found tucked between the letters when the full impact hit her. It showed Alice and Sebastian at what was clearly an upscale restaurant, Alice's face glowing with happiness, Sebastian's hand covering hers on the table. Alice was visibly pregnant in the photo. The date stamp read March 15th, 1996, almost 2 months before Lily's death. But it was what she found in the third box that shattered her remaining illusions about her family's foundation. Medical bills. Dozens of them, dating from Sebastian's first marriage to Lily.
The letterhead read Pacific Northwest Fertility Clinic, and the patient name was Sebastian M. Grant. The dates spanned from 1990 to 1995, years when Miles, Evie, and Jonah were already born. Celeste spread the bills across her floor, her social worker's eye immediately picking out the pattern. Consultation fees, sperm analysis, hormone therapy. The clinical language was dry, but the story it told was devastating. Sebastian had been desperate to have children with Lily, undergoing years of increasingly expensive and invasive treatments. The final bill, dated December 1995, included a consultation summary that made Celeste's hands shake as she read it. Patient presents with severe oligospermia, previous treatments unsuccessful. Discussed adoption options and third-party sperm donation. Patient declined further intervention. Severe oligospermia. Even with her limited medical knowledge, Celeste understood what that meant. Sebastian had an extremely low sperm count, so low that natural conception was nearly impossible. She sank back against her couch, surrounded by the evidence of deceptions layered upon deceptions. Alice and Sebastian had been having an affair while Lily was dying. Alice had gotten pregnant during that affair, pregnant with Celeste. Meanwhile, Sebastian had been struggling with fertility issues that made it unlikely he was the biological father of any of Lily's children. Her phone buzzed with a text from Evie. "Hope the photos bring back good memories. You were always Dad's little shadow when we were kids." Dad's little shadow. The irony was almost unbearable. Celeste looked around her apartment at the scattered evidence of her mother's secrets. In one corner, Alice's jewelry box gaped open like a mouth revealing lies. On her coffee table, love letters documented an affair that had produced her conception. Spread across her floor, medical bills suggested that Sebastian might have been sterile during his first marriage. Everything she had believed about her family was wrong. She reached for Alice's jewelry box again, this time checking every compartment. In the very bottom, beneath the removable tray, her fingers found something else. A folded paper with Dr. Patricia Hoffman written in Alice's careful handwriting, along with a phone number and address. Alice's doctor. The woman who would have treated her during her pregnancy with Celeste. For the first time in 2 weeks, Celeste felt a spark of something other than grief and confusion. She felt purpose. Alice's secrets had been buried for 28 years, but secrets, in Celeste's experience, were never buried deep enough to stay hidden forever. Dr. Patricia Hoffman might have the answers Alice had taken to her grave. Dr. Patricia Hoffman lived in a craftsman house in the Laurelhurst neighborhood, where Portland's old money had settled decades ago. The home's Tudor Revival architecture spoke of permanence, of families who'd weathered generations of secrets behind leaded glass windows. As Celeste rang the doorbell, she wondered how many confessions these walls had absorbed over the years. The woman who answered the door was smaller than Celeste had expected, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair pulled into a practical bun. But her eyes were sharp, assessing, the kind of gaze that had looked into countless women's faces during their most vulnerable moments. "Dr. Hoffman?"
I'm Celeste Collins. I called about my mother, Alice Rivera. Recognition flickered across the elderly woman's features, followed immediately by wariness. Yes, I remember your call, though I'm not sure what I can tell you after all these years. Patient confidentiality doesn't end with death. I understand your position, Celeste said, pulling the manila folder from her bag. But I've discovered some things that suggest my mother's situation was more complicated than I knew. I'm hoping you can help me understand. Dr. Hoffman studied her for a long moment, then stepped aside to let her enter. The interior of the house matched its exterior. Dark wood paneling, built-in bookcases filled with medical journals spanning 5 decades, family photographs documenting a lifetime of service. Dr. Hoffman led her to a study where afternoon light filtered through heavy curtains, creating the kind of atmosphere that encouraged confession.
Your mother was one of my most memorable patients, Dr. Hoffman said without preamble, settling into a leather chair across from Celeste. Not because of medical complications. You were a perfectly normal pregnancy and delivery, but because of your emotional state. I've never seen a woman carry such guilt about bringing life into the world. Celeste spread Alice's letters across the coffee table between them. I found these in her belongings. They suggest she was having an affair with Sebastian Grant while he was still married to his first wife. Dr. Hoffman's eyebrows rose as she scanned the letters, but she didn't seem surprised. Your mother came to me in March of 1996, about 3 months pregnant. She was terrified, not of childbirth, but of what her pregnancy meant for everyone involved. Because she was having an affair with a married man whose wife was dying? More than that. Dr. Hoffman leaned back in her chair, weighing her words carefully. Your mother confided things to me that she couldn't tell anyone else. She was desperately in love with Sebastian, but she also genuinely cared for Lily Grant. Alice had been helping care for Lily during her final illness. That's how the affair started. The guilt was eating her alive. Celeste pulled out the hospital bracelet and fertility clinic bills. I also found these. It looks like Sebastian was being treated for fertility problems during his first marriage. Dr. Hoffman's expression grew more serious. What exactly are you hoping to learn, Celeste? The truth about my father, about my family. Celeste's voice carried the steady determination she'd learned in crisis counseling. My stepfather, Sebastian, died recently. He left me nothing in his will, completely excluded me while leaving everything to his other 3 children. I need to understand why. The elderly doctor was quiet for a long moment, studying Celeste's face with the intensity of someone making a difficult diagnosis. Finally, she sighed and reached for a photo on her desk, a black and white picture of herself as a young doctor surrounded by newborns. Your mother made me promise never to reveal what she told me, but you're not a child anymore, and Alice is gone. Perhaps it's time. Celeste's heart hammered as Dr. Hoffman continued. Sebastian Grant is your biological father. Your mother was absolutely certain of this, though she never told him directly. The affair had been going on for several months before Alice became pregnant, and she knew the timing made Sebastian's paternity undeniable. The words hit Celeste like a physical blow, even though part of her had suspected this truth. But he was being treated for fertility problems. Severe ones, yes. Your mother knew about his medical issues, another source of her guilt. She felt like she'd achieved what his dying wife couldn't, and it tormented her. Dr. Hoffman's voice softened. Alice was convinced that if Sebastian knew you were conceived during their affair, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
While Lily was dying, he would never forgive either of you. She thought he might even reject you entirely. So she never told him. Never. As far as Sebastian knew, you were born slightly premature after Alice moved in to help with the children. The timeline worked if no one looked too closely. Dr. Hoffman pulled a manila envelope from her desk drawer. Your mother left these with me, with instructions that they only be given to you if you ever came asking the right questions. Celeste's hands trembled as she accepted the envelope. Inside were copies of medical records, paternity documentation Alice had secretly maintained, and a letter in her mother's handwriting. Alice loved Sebastian deeply, Dr. Hoffman said gently, but she loved you more. Every decision she made was to protect you from the circumstances of your conception. She thought it was better for you to be Sebastian's beloved stepdaughter than his reminder of betrayal and guilt. Celeste looked up from the documents, her worldview reshaping itself in real time. He never knew I was his biological child. No, and neither did his other children know they weren't. Dr. Hoffman's words were careful, measured. Alice confided that Lily had told her, during her final illness, about her children's true parentage. Multiple fathers, all from before her marriage to Sebastian.
Lily had been grateful that Sebastian loved her children as his own, despite his fertility issues making biological paternity impossible. The room fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock. Celeste stared at the documents in her hands, proof that she was Sebastian's only biological child, while the siblings who'd inherited everything shared no blood with him at all. "What do I do with this?" she whispered. Dr. Hoffman's eyes were kind, but unflinching. "That, my dear, is the question your mother spent your entire life trying to answer." The DNA testing kit sat on Eleanor Grant's mahogany desk like evidence in a murder trial. Celeste had called the attorney the morning after her meeting with Dr. Hoffman, her voice steady despite the earthquake of revelations still reshaping her understanding of everything she'd believed about her family. "You're certain about this?" Eleanor asked, her steel-gray eyes studying the documents Celeste had spread across her desk. Dr. Hoffman's medical records, Alice's letters, the fertility clinic bills, all the pieces of a puzzle that painted a devastating picture of deception and misplaced love. Dr. Hoffman confirmed it. "Sebastian is my biological father. Alice knew it, but never told him." Celeste's voice carried the clinical detachment she used when discussing her clients' most traumatic cases. And according to what Alice confided to the doctor, Miles, Evie, and Jonah aren't Sebastian's biological children either. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled as she processed the implications. "DNA testing will give us definitive proof, but it's a Pandora's box, Celeste. Once we have that evidence, you'll have to decide what to do with it. I need to know the truth first, all of it." Eleanor nodded and reached for her phone. "I still have contacts at the lab we use for paternity cases. Expedited results will take 72 hours. She paused, her expression growing more serious. "There's something else you should know. I did some digging after our last conversation, pulled some old files. I found Lily Grant's medical records from her pregnancies." She opened a thick folder and withdrew several documents. Lily was already pregnant when she married Sebastian in 1989. The marriage certificate is dated September 15th. Miles was born February 22nd, 1990. Do the math. Celeste calculated quickly. She was 4 months pregnant when they married. And look at this. Eleanor slid another document across the desk. Evie's birth certificate shows she was born in 1992, but there's a notation here from the hospital records, father unknown, mother's request. Same notation on Jonah's birth certificate from 1994. The weight of the revelations was staggering. Celeste stared at the birth certificates, seeing her siblings' names in a new context. The weight of the revelations was staggering. Celeste stared at the birth certificates, seeing her siblings' names in a new context.
Lily had 3 children with 3 different men, and Sebastian raised them all as his own. While struggling with fertility issues that made biological paternity virtually impossible, Eleanor confirmed, I pulled Sebastian's complete medical files. The oligospermia was diagnosed in 1988, before his marriage to Lily. His sperm count was less than 1% of normal. Celeste picked up one of Sebastian's fertility clinic bills, studying the dates and treatments. The story they told was heartbreaking. A man desperate to have children, undergoing years of unsuccessful procedures, while unknowingly raising 3 children who weren't biologically his. "He must have suspected," she said quietly. "Perhaps, but love isn't always about biology, is it?" Eleanor's voice carried an odd note of personal experience. Sebastian loved those children. That part was real, whatever their genetic heritage. 3 days later, Celeste sat in the same chair, staring at lab results that confirmed everything Dr. Hoffman had revealed. The DNA analysis was unambiguous. Sebastian Grant was definitively her biological father, with a 99.97% probability. The test she'd run on hair samples from Miles, Evie's, and Jonah's childhood belongings, items Eleanor had helped her access from Sebastian's personal effects, told an equally clear story. None of them shared Sebastian's DNA. "Genetically speaking," Eleanor said, reading from the lab report, "Miles, Evie, and Jonah are half-siblings to each other, but not to you.
They share Lily as a mother, but have 3 different fathers. You share Sebastian as a father, but have a different mother. The irony was overwhelming. She was Sebastian's only biological child, yet she was the one excluded from his will. The children he'd legally claimed and provided for, the ones who'd received his entire estate, shared no genetic connection to him at all. From a legal standpoint, Eleanor continued, you have grounds to contest the will. As Sebastian's biological heir, you could claim the entire estate. Celeste stared out the window to Portland's skyline, watching clouds gather over the West Hills where Sebastian's house, now Miles's house, stood among the other monuments to old money and established families. What would that require? Filing a formal challenge, presenting this evidence to the court. It would become public record, the DNA results, the medical records, all of it. Eleanor's voice was carefully neutral. Miles, Evie, and Jonah would learn that Sebastian wasn't their biological father. Their entire understanding of themselves would be destroyed. The magnitude of the choice before her was paralyzing. Justice versus compassion, truth versus mercy, her legal rights versus her siblings' emotional well-being. There's something else, Eleanor said, pulling out a final folder. I found this in Sebastian's personal safe when I was settling the estate. He never opened it, but it's addressed to him from Lily, dated just before her death. Celeste accepted the sealed envelope with trembling hands. Lily's final message to Sebastian, preserved for over 2 decades. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Lily's shaking handwriting. My darling Sebastian, I know you've suspected the truth about the children. I see it in your eyes sometimes when you look at them. They are not your blood, but they are your heart. You chose to love them anyway, and that makes you more their father than the men who contributed nothing but DNA. Please don't let my secrets poison the love you've built. Biology doesn't make a family, choice does. You chose us, and we chose you. Forever grateful, Lily. Celeste read the letter twice, then looked up at Eleanor. He knew. Sebastian knew they weren't his biological children, and he loved them anyway. And yet, he excluded you from his will, even though you were his biological daughter. Eleanor's voice was gentle but pointed. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Looking at the DNA results spread across the desk, scientific proof of relationships that had been hidden, denied, and complicated by decades of well-meaning deceptions, Celeste realized she held the power to reshape her entire family's understanding of themselves. The only question was whether she had the courage to use it. Celeste hadn't slept properly in 4 days. The DNA results lay hidden beneath her mattress like contraband, their scientific certainty haunting her every waking moment. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the lab report's stark percentages: 99.97% probability that Sebastian was her father, 0% probability that he was father to Miles, Evie, or Jonah. Numbers didn't lie, but they could destroy lives with surgical precision. Her apartment had become a shrine to deception. Alice's letters were taped to the bathroom mirror where she'd see them each morning, a reminder that her entire existence was built on a lie her mother carried to the grave. The fertility clinic bills covered her coffee table like evidence in a trial she was prosecuting against herself. And in the corner, the boxes Evie had saved for her sat like silent witnesses to a family built on foundations of sand. The knock on her door Wednesday evening made her heart race. Through the peephole, she saw Evie standing in the hallway holding a bottle of wine and wearing the kind of smile that came from financial relief mixed with lingering guilt. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by," Evie said when Celeste opened the door.
I felt like we needed to talk. Really talk. Celeste stepped aside to let her in, hastily gathering the scattered documents from her coffee table and shoving them into a kitchen drawer. Her hands shook as she poured 2 glasses of the wine Evie had brought, a bottle that probably cost more than Celeste typically spent on groceries in a week. I can't stop thinking about the will reading, Evie began, settling onto the couch where Celeste had been sitting moments before, obsessively reviewing Sebastian's medical records. It's not right, Celeste. Dad excluding you like that. I don't understand it. Celeste forced herself to sit across from her half-sister, No, her stepsister, she corrected mentally. The woman who shared no blood with Sebastian, but had received $400,000 based on his belief that she was his daughter. He made his choice, Celeste managed, her voice steadier than her hands. But it's the wrong choice. Evie's eyes filled with tears, the kind of genuine emotion that made Celeste's secret feel like acid in her chest. You were there for him when Mom died. You helped him with his medication, his paperwork. You called him Dad for 21 years. And you didn't? The words came out sharper than Celeste intended. Of course I did. But we always knew we were different situations. Miles, Jonah, and I, we were his first family. You came later, with Alice. She paused, studying Celeste's face. That doesn't make you less family, though. It never should have. The irony was suffocating. Evie's guilt was genuine, her love for Celeste real, but it was all based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who belonged to whom. Celeste wanted to scream that she was Sebastian's first family, his only biological family, but the words lodged in her throat like broken glass. Sophie asked me yesterday if Aunt Celeste would help her with her college applications when she's older. She remembers how you helped her with math homework last Christmas. Kids don't forget kindness. Celeste's chest tightened. Sophie and Lucas, Evie's children, were 8 and 6 respectively. Their college fund was now secured by inheritance money their grandfather had legally left to their mother, money that belonged by blood to Celeste. But those children had done nothing wrong except exist in a family built on decades-old lies. The inheritance will make such a difference for them, Evie said, her voice carrying wonder and relief. I can stop working 3 jobs. I can actually be present for their childhood instead of constantly scrambling to pay rent. Celeste nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Every word Evie spoke was another weight added to the crushing burden of her knowledge. Her phone rang Thursday morning when she was getting ready for work. Miles's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment she considered letting it go to voicemail, but her professional training had taught her that avoiding difficult conversations only made them worse. Celeste, I wanted to run something by you, Miles said without preamble. His voice carried the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his right to inherit. I'm meeting with Dad's business partners next week about expanding the consulting firm. There might be opportunities for additional staff if you're interested in leaving social work. The casual assumption in his voice that she would be grateful for scraps from the table she should rightfully own made her grip the phone harder. I'm sure you could use the increase in salary, and it would keep you connected to Dad's legacy. Dad's legacy. Miles had no idea he was discussing inheriting a business from a man who shared none of his DNA while offering charity employment to the man's actual biological heir. I'll think about it, I managed. Good. The expansion plans are ambitious, but Dad always said family businesses work best when they stay in the family. Family. The word had lost all meaning, becoming just another tool for torture in Celeste's expanding arsenal of painful ironies. But it was Jonah's call Friday night that nearly broke her resolve entirely. I know the will was unfair, he said without preamble when she answered. His voice carried the rawness of someone who'd been drinking, but also a sincerity that cut straight through her defenses. I want to share my inheritance with you. Half of it, $100,000. Celeste sat down hard on her couch, staring at the kitchen drawer where the DNA results were hidden. Jonah, who had received the smallest inheritance, who had always been the family outsider, who struggled with addiction and had never felt Sebastian's approval, wanted to give her half of his windfall. Jonah, you don't need to... Yes, I do. Dad was wrong to exclude you. I don't know why he did it, but I know it was wrong.
His voice broke slightly. You're my sister, Celeste. That matters more than some legal document. Sister. The word hit her like a physical blow, because legally, genetically, she wasn't his sister at all. But emotionally, in all the ways that had mattered during their shared childhood, she was. That night, Celeste lay awake, staring at her ceiling, her heart racing with what felt like a continuous panic attack. The weight of this secret was becoming unbearable, but so was the thought of what revealing it would do to these people she loved despite everything. Ivy's children would lose their college funds, Miles would lose his identity as Sebastian's heir, Jonah's final gesture of paternal acceptance would be revealed as meaningless, and she would gain a fortune built on the complete destruction of the only family she'd ever known. The truth was supposed to set people free, but sometimes, Celeste realized, it just built more elaborate prisons. The Portland State University campus looked smaller than Celeste remembered as she walked across the rain-slicked quad toward Kramer Cafe. 5 years had passed since she'd graduated with her master's in social work, but the familiar brick buildings and towering evergreens still carried the weight of formative memories. She was meeting Dr. Maria Santos, her former supervisor, though she couldn't explain exactly why she'd reached out to her old mentor. Dr. Santos looked older than her 62 years, her dark hair now completely silver, but her eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had guided Celeste through her most challenging cases. She'd already claimed a corner table away from the typical student crowd, 2 cups of coffee steaming between empty chairs. "You sounded troubled on the phone," Dr. Santos said, as Celeste sat down. Her voice carried the gentle authority of someone who'd spent decades helping people navigate their darkest moments. "Family crisis, you said." Celeste wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, using the warmth to steady herself. For 4 days, she'd been rehearsing how to present her dilemma without revealing the specific details. But now, faced with the woman who'd taught her the fundamentals of ethical practice, words felt inadequate. "I'm dealing with a situation involving family inheritance. There's been a discovery, information that could significantly change financial outcomes for several family members, including myself." Dr. Santos leaned back in her chair, immediately recognizing the clinical distance in Celeste's language. "You're speaking like you're presenting a case study. This is personal, isn't it?" "Very personal." Celeste stared into her coffee, watching steam rise like the ghosts of secrets she couldn't release. "Let's say, hypothetically, that someone discovered they had legal rights to something that had been given to others, but claiming those rights would cause devastating emotional harm to people they care about." "Justice versus compassion," Dr. Santos said, nodding slowly. "One of the oldest ethical dilemmas. What kind of harm are we talking about?" Celeste chose her words carefully. "Identity destruction. These people have built their entire sense of self around beliefs that would be shattered by the truth. And what would claiming these rights mean for you personally?" The question cut straight to the heart of Celeste's internal struggle. Financial security, but more than that. Recognition. Validation that I belong somewhere I've always felt like an outsider. Dr. Santos was quiet for a long moment, studying Celeste's face with the intensity she'd once brought to their supervision sessions. "In our field, we often encounter situations where the truth serves different masters. Sometimes it serves healing, sometimes destruction. The question isn't whether to reveal truth, but whether doing so serves the greater good. How do you measure that? How do you weigh one person's financial need against another person's psychological welfare? You don't alone." Dr. Santos reached across the table, her weathered hand covering Celeste's. "Tell me about your motivations. Strip away the hypotheticals. What's driving this need for recognition?" The question hit like a physical blow. Celeste had been so focused on the ethical implications that she hadn't examined her own underlying wounds. "I've spent my entire life feeling like I didn't quite fit in, like I was tolerated but not truly wanted. This information, it would prove that I actually belonged more than anyone realized."
And if you had that proof, that validation, what would change? Celeste considered the question, surprised by her own answer. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. I don't know. Dr. Santos leaned forward, her expression growing more serious. I've seen family secrets destroy relationships, Celeste. I've also seen truth bring healing that seemed impossible. But I've never seen external validation cure internal wounds about belonging. So what are you saying? I'm saying that if you're seeking this revelation primarily to heal your own sense of displacement, you might be disappointed by the outcome. Dr. Santos's voice carried the gentle firmness of someone delivering difficult but necessary feedback. Belonging isn't something that can be proven with documents. It's built through relationship, through choice, through love consistently given and received. Celeste felt tears threatening and blinked them back. But what if the relationships were built on lies? Most relationships contain elements of deception, small and large. The question is whether those deceptions were motivated by malice or protection. Dr. Santos paused to sip her coffee. I had a case once, a family where the patriarch had been living under a false identity for 40 years, hiding from a criminal past. When the truth came out, it destroyed some relationships, but strengthened others. The determining factor wasn't the deception itself, but how family members chose to respond to it. How do you know which choice will lead to which outcome? You don't. That's why these decisions require such careful consideration. Dr. Santos pulled out her phone and showed Celeste a photo of a young woman in graduation robes. My granddaughter just finished her PhD in psychology. Want to know what her dissertation was about? Celeste nodded. The long-term psychological impact of family secret revolutions on children and adolescents. Her research found that the trauma wasn't in the secrets themselves, but in how adults handled the revelation process. Secrets revealed in anger or for personal gain caused lasting damage. Secrets revealed with careful consideration for all parties, with support systems in place, sometimes brought families closer together. So, timing and motivation matter more than the truth itself? Intent matters enormously. Are you seeking justice, or are you seeking revenge for being excluded? Are you trying to right a wrong, or are you trying to prove your worth? Dr. Santos's questions were gentle, but unrelenting. Because if it's the latter, this revelation won't give you what you're really looking for. Celeste sat in silence, forced to confront the complexity of her own motivations. Justice and revenge felt impossibly intertwined. Recognition and validation had become indistinguishable from her desire for financial security. What would you advise? She finally asked. Observe first. Understand the full scope of who would be affected and how. Consider not just the immediate impact, but the long-term consequences for everyone involved, including yourself. Dr. Santos gathered her things, preparing to leave. And ask yourself this. If you knew for certain that revealing this information would never bring you the sense of belonging you're seeking, would you still feel compelled to pursue it? As her former mentor walked away, Celeste remained at the table, staring out at the campus where she'd learned to help others navigate their most difficult decisions. Now she faced her own impossible choice, armed with professional training that felt inadequate to the task of untangling her personal pain from her ethical obligations. The question Dr. Santos had left her with echoed in her mind. Would she pursue truth for its own sake, or only as a means to heal wounds that might be beyond any external remedy? Miles' invitation had come the day after Celeste's meeting with Dr. Santos, as if the universe were conspiring to force her into exactly the kind of observation her former mentor had recommended. Family dinner, he'd said over the phone, his voice carrying an unfamiliar warmth. Like we used to do when Dad was alive. I think we need to stick together now. Now Celeste stood on the front steps of the house where she'd spent her teenage years, holding a bottle of wine she couldn't afford, and steeling herself for an evening of performance art. The Grand Tour revival looked exactly the same, Sebastian's pride and joy with its leaded glass windows and meticulously maintained gardens. But knowing it now belonged to Miles, knowing he was living in the master bedroom where Sebastian had slept,
felt like watching strangers inhabit her childhood memories. Miles opened the door wearing an apron that read, "World's Greatest Dad," a Father's Day gift from Sebastian years ago that he'd apparently claimed along with everything else. The sight of it made Celeste's chest tighten, but she forced a smile as he embraced her.
"Welcome home," he said. And the word home carried weight that felt both genuine and devastating. The dining room was exactly as Sebastian had left it, down to the family photos lining the mahogany sideboard. Pictures of Miles graduating law school, Evie's wedding, Jonah's high school band concerts. Celeste appeared in some of them, but always slightly to the side, as if the photographer hadn't been quite sure where she belonged in the frame. Evie arrived 20 minutes later with Sophie and Lucas in tow, their faces bright with the kind of security that came from knowing their futures were financially guaranteed. Jonah appeared last, carrying his guitar case and looking like he'd made an effort to dress appropriately for the occasion. His black shirt was wrinkled but clean, and he'd pulled his hair back into something resembling respectability. "Just like old times," Evie said, as they took their seats around the table where they'd shared hundreds of meals. But it wasn't like old times, Celeste realized. Sebastian's empty chair at the head of the table dominated the space, a reminder of absence that made every conversation feel hollow. Miles served dinner with the confident efficiency of someone who'd claimed not just Sebastian's house, but his role as family patriarch. As they ate, he launched into an explanation of his plans for Grant and Associates that revealed how completely his identity was wrapped around inheriting Sebastian's legacy. "Dad always said the consulting business was about relationships built over generations," Miles explained, his eyes bright with ambition. "I want to expand into the Seattle market, maybe eventually Portland's eastern suburbs. The Grant name carries weight in Pacific Northwest business circles." The Grant name. Celeste watched Miles speak with passionate intensity about building on Sebastian's foundation, about honoring his memory through growth and success. He had no idea that the name he wore so proudly connected him to nothing but 28 years of a lie well told. "I've been thinking about bringing on additional staff," Miles continued, glancing at Celeste, "family members who understand Dad's values and vision." There it was again. The casual assumption that she should be grateful for inclusion in the empire built on her biological father's work, now controlled by someone who shared no genetic connection to its founder. Evie's contribution to the conversation was even more heartbreaking. "I've been looking into private schools for Sophie and Lucas," she said, her voice carrying wonder at possibilities that had been impossibly out of reach just weeks ago. "There's a Montessori program that emphasizes the kind of values Dad believed in: critical thinking, ethical reasoning, community responsibility." She talked about Sebastian's values as if they were hereditary traits passed down through bloodline, not knowing that her children carried none of his DNA. But they did carry his influence, Celeste realized. 28 years of being raised by a man who'd chosen to love them had shaped who they were, regardless of biology. "Dad would be so proud to know his grandchildren will have opportunities he never had," Evie continued, reaching across the table to squeeze Miles' hand. "We're carrying forward his legacy." Legacy. The word kept recurring like a prayer they all needed to believe. But it was Jonah's contribution that nearly shattered Celeste's remaining composure. After dinner, as they moved to Sebastian's study for coffee, he settled into Sebastian's leather reading chair with his guitar and played a song Celeste had never heard before. "I wrote this after the will reading," he said quietly. "It's called Finally Home." The lyrics spoke of a son who'd always felt like a disappointment, who'd struggled with addiction and artistic dreams that seemed frivolous compared to business success. But in the end, the song suggested, even a black sheep could find acceptance, could earn a place in the family fold through persistence and love. "Dad leaving me that inheritance," Jonah said after finishing the song, "it felt like he was saying I was worth something after all. Like maybe my music wasn't just a phase he tolerated." Celeste had to excuse herself to the bathroom to compose herself.
Jonah's entire sense of self-worth was now built on Sebastian's final gesture of acceptance, an acceptance that was legally meaningful, but genetically hollow. When she returned, Evie was showing Sophie and Lucas photos from Sebastian's desk, explaining who their grandfather had been, what kind of man he'd aspired to raise them to become. The children listened with the solemn attention of young people being inducted into family mythology. "Aunt Celeste, did Grandpa Sebastian really teach you to drive in his old Buick?" Sophie asked, looking up from a photo of Celeste's 16th birthday. "He did," I managed. "He was very patient with me. More patient than with his legal children," she realized. Sebastian had spent hours teaching her parallel parking, had taken her for ice cream after she'd passed her driving test, and had seemed genuinely proud of her accomplishment. At the time, she'd had assumed it was the attention any stepmother might give. Now she wondered if some unconscious biological connection had influenced his behavior. As the evening wound down, Evie pulled Celeste aside in the kitchen where they'd once baked cookies together for school fundraisers. "I've been seeing a therapist," she said quietly, "to help process Dad's death and some other things. She's helped me understand that Dad struggled with his own sense of identity and belonging, especially after Mom died. I think that's why family meant so much to him. He'd lost so much that he held on to what he had with both hands." The irony was suffocating. Sebastian had indeed held on to family with both hands, loving children who weren't biologically his while unconsciously neglecting the one who was. "She thinks Dad might have excluded you from the will because he was afraid," Evie continued. "Afraid that if he gave you too much, Miles, Jonah, and I might feel like we mattered less, like his love was being divided rather than multiplied." "That's an interesting theory," I managed. "Oh, before I forget, I found some more of Alice's things in Dad's study. Personal items, letters, some jewelry. Would you like me to set them aside for you?" My heart raced. That would be nice. As she drove home that night, Celeste realized that Dr. Santos had been right about the importance of observation. She now understood with devastating clarity what her revelation would destroy. Not just financial security, but the fundamental beliefs about identity, belonging, and love that had shaped 3 lives for nearly 3 decades. But she also understood something else. Sebastian loved them all, in his imperfect, complicated way. Biology had nothing to do with it. 3 days later, Celeste stood in Sebastian's study, surrounded by the mahogany paneling and leather-bound books that had always felt like a sanctuary. Evie had left her alone with 2 small boxes of Alice's belongings, items that had somehow migrated to Sebastian's private space over the years since her mother's death.
The afternoon light filtered through heavy curtains, casting long shadows across the Persian rug where Celeste had once sat doing homework while Sebastian worked at his desk. "Take your time," Evie had said before leaving. "I'll be upstairs with the kids if you need anything." The first box contained the expected items: Alice's reading glasses, a few pieces of costume jewelry, photographs from their brief marriage. But it was the second box that made Celeste's breath catch. Nestled beneath a silk scarf was a manila envelope with Sebastian written in Alice's careful handwriting, along with a date that made Celeste's heart race: March 10, 2012. Less than 3 weeks before Alice had died from the stroke that took her so suddenly. The envelope was sealed, the flap yellowed with age but still firmly closed. Alice had written this letter to Sebastian in her final days, but had never given it to him. Celeste turned the envelope over in her hands, knowing that whatever it contained would change everything she thought she understood about her parents' relationship. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal. "My dearest Sebastian, I am writing this knowing I may never have the courage to give it to you, but also knowing that if something happens to me, these truths will die with me unless I put them somewhere safe. Dr. Martinez says my blood pressure is dangerously high and I can feel something changing in my body. If this letter finds its way to you, it means I'm gone, and you're reading the words I was too cowardly to speak aloud. I need you to know that I have carried lies for 28 years, lies that shaped all of our lives. Some of them were mine to carry, but others belonged to people who trusted me with their secrets, and I have honored that trust at the cost of my own peace. The affair we had while Lily was dying, I know you remember it differently than I do. You think it started from loneliness and proximity, two people finding comfort in an impossible situation. But the truth is that I loved you long before Lily got sick. I loved you from the first time we met at that church fundraiser in 1994, when you were so proud showing off Miles's science fair project. I fell in love with a man who was completely devoted to his family, and I hated myself for it. When Lily asked me to help care for her during her illness, I said yes because I wanted to be near you, even knowing how wrong it was. The affair wasn't an accident, Sebastian. It was my choice, my sin, my desperate grab at something I knew I could never truly have. Celeste had to stop reading, her vision blurring with tears. Alice's confession was raw with guilt and self-recrimination, but it was also building towards something larger. She wiped her eyes and continued. I know you suspected that Miles, Evie, and Jonah weren't your biological children. I saw it in your eyes sometimes when people commented on how different they looked from you. You knew about your fertility issues, had been living with that knowledge since before they were born, but you never said anything, never demanded tests or confirmation. You chose to love them as your own, and that choice made you more their father than biology ever could have. Lily told me the truth about the children during her final weeks. She was so grateful to you for loving them without question, for giving them stability and a name and a future. She said she'd never met a man with a bigger heart, and she was right. You built a family through choice, not chance. But there's something else I need you to know, something that has tortured me every day since Celeste was born. When I discovered I was pregnant during our affair, I knew immediately that you were the father. The timing was unmistakable. But I also knew that if I told you, you would forever associate our daughter with betrayal, with the worst moment of your life when you failed the woman you'd promised to love in sickness and in health. Celeste's hands shook as she processed what she was reading. Alice had known. She had known that Sebastian was Celeste's biological father, but she had chosen to keep that knowledge from him. I made a choice to let you believe Celeste came after our relationship became legitimate, after Lily died and we could love each other openly. I let you think she was premature, rather than admit she was conceived in sin. I robbed you of the knowledge that you had finally achieved what you'd wanted so desperately with Lily, a biological child of your own. But I also robbed Celeste of something precious. She has always felt like an outsider in our family, and I know it's because you held back your love from her, afraid of seeming to favor the new child over the ones you'd raised from infancy. If you had known she was yours by blood, would you have loved her differently? Would she have felt more secure in her place with us? These are questions that have haunted me, Sebastian. I see how she watches you with Miles, how she tries so hard to earn approval that comes naturally to your legal children. She doesn't understand that your caution with her comes from trying to be fair to everyone, not from any lack of love. I'm telling you this now because I think you deserve to know the truth before I'm gone. Celeste is your daughter, your biological child, the genetic legacy you wanted so desperately with Lily. But Miles, Evie, and Jonah are your children too, in every way that matters. You chose them, you raised them, you loved them into the people they've become. Biology doesn't make a family. Choice does. You've proven that every day for 28 years. Please don't let my deceptions poison what you've built. Please don't let the circumstances of Celeste's conception overshadow the love that created her. And please, if you can find it in your heart, help her understand that she has always belonged with us, even when it didn't feel that way. I love you more than words can express, and I'm sorry for every lie I told and every truth I kept hidden. Forever yours, Alice. Celeste sat in Sebastian's chair, her mother's letter trembling in her hands, and finally understood the full scope of the tragedy that had shaped her entire life. Alice had carried the weight of multiple deceptions, protecting everyone's feelings at the cost of her own peace. Sebastian had suspected truths he'd chosen not to pursue, loving children who weren't his, while unconsciously withholding complete acceptance from the one who was. And she had spent 28 years feeling like an outsider in a family where she was actually the most legitimate member by birth, but had been denied that knowledge by her mother's well-intentioned lies. The cruelest irony was that Sebastian had died never knowing he'd achieved his deepest desire, having a biological child. And Alice had died carrying the secret that might have changed everything between them. Celeste sat in Sebastian's chair, her mother's letter trembling in her hands, and finally understood the full scope of the tragedy that had shaped her entire life. Alice had carried the weight of multiple deceptions, protecting everyone's feelings at the cost of her own peace. Sebastian had suspected truths he'd chosen not to pursue, loving children who weren't his, while unconsciously withholding complete acceptance from the one who was. And she had spent 28 years feeling like an outsider in a family where she was actually the most legitimate member by birth, but had been denied that knowledge by her mother's well-intentioned lies. The cruelest irony was that Sebastian had died never knowing he'd achieved his deepest desire, having a biological child, and Alice had died carrying the secret that might have changed everything between them. Celeste sat in Sebastian's chair, her mother's letter trembling in her hands, and finally understood the full scope of the tragedy that had shaped her entire life. Alice had carried the weight of multiple deceptions, protecting everyone's feelings at the cost of her own peace. Sebastian had suspected truths he'd chosen not to pursue, loving children who weren't his, while unconsciously withholding complete acceptance from the one who was. And she had spent 28 years feeling like an outsider in a family where she was actually the most legitimate member by birth, but had been denied that knowledge by her mother's well-intentioned lies. Celeste sat in Sebastian's leather chair for another hour after finishing Alice's letter, the weight of 28 years of family deception settling into her bones like a chronic ache. The study felt different now. Not like a sanctuary, but like a museum dedicated to the complexity of love and the price of well-intentioned lies. She was still holding the letter when her phone rang, Eleanor Grant's name appearing on the screen with an urgency that made her stomach clench. "Celeste, I need you to come to my office immediately." Eleanor's voice was tight with controlled panic.
Miles has filed incorporation papers for a business restructure. If we're going to challenge the will, we have 48 hours before the window closes entirely. The words hit Celeste like cold water. What does that mean exactly? It means he's moving Sebastian's assets into a new corporate structure that would make any legal challenge exponentially more complex and public. Right now, contesting the will would be a private family matter handled through probate court. After this restructure, it becomes a corporate lawsuit that would involve business partners, creditors, and public filings. Celeste looked around the study where she just discovered the final piece of her family's puzzle. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. The drive to Eleanor's office felt like traveling toward her own execution. Portland's evening traffic moved with typical sluggishness, giving her too much time to think about what she was about to decide. Alice's letter was folded in her purse, its revelations still reverberating through her understanding of everything she'd believed about her parents' relationship. Eleanor's office building was mostly empty at 7 p.m., fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows in the marble lobby. When Celeste reached the 23rd floor, she found Eleanor pacing behind her desk, legal documents spread across every available surface. "I've pulled everything together," Eleanor said without preamble, gesturing to stacks of papers. "DNA results, medical records, Alice's correspondence, Sebastian's fertility treatments. Everything needed to prove you're his biological heir and that Miles, Evie, and Jonah have no genetic claim to the estate." Celeste settled into the familiar chair across from Eleanor's desk, but this time the mahogany surface between them felt like an altar where she was about to sacrifice either her principles or her future. "There's something else you need to know," Eleanor continued, pulling out a thick folder.
I found this in Sebastian's safe deposit box when settling the estate. It's a letter he wrote but never sent, addressed to you. Celeste's heart hammered as she accepted another envelope, another secret from beyond the grave. Sebastian's handwriting was shakier than Alice's, evidence of the blood pressure issues that had plagued his final years. Dear Celeste, I know I have not been the father to you that I was to Miles, Evie, and Jonah, and I know you felt that difference. You're too intelligent and too kind to ever say so, but I see the hurt in your eyes when I favor them unconsciously. I want you to understand that my distance comes from fear, not lack of love. When Alice and I began our relationship, I was a broken man who had failed at everything that mattered: marriage, fatherhood, providing the family Lily deserved. You represented a second chance, but also a reminder of my moral failure. Every time I looked at you, I saw both my greatest joy and my deepest shame. I held back my love because I was afraid of seeming to replace Lily's children with Alice's daughter. I was afraid they would feel abandoned if they saw me loving you the way I wanted to. So I tried to love you all equally, which meant loving none of you completely. This was wrong. You deserved better. You deserved a father who could see you for who you are rather than what you represented. You are the kindest, most thoughtful of all my children, and I failed you by not recognizing that sooner. I hope someday you can forgive an old man's mistakes. Celeste looked up at Eleanor, tears blurring her vision. When did he write this? 6 months before he died. I think he was planning to give it to you, but... Eleanor's voice trailed off. But he never found the courage. Celeste folded the letter carefully, adding it to the growing collection of unsent confessions from her parents. Just like Alice never found the courage to tell him I was his biological daughter. Eleanor opened her briefcase and pulled out the legal documents that would change everything. The challenge papers. All they need is your signature, and they'll be filed within the hour. Miles would receive notice tomorrow morning that his inheritance is being contested. Celeste stared at the papers, black ink on white paper that represented the power to reshape her entire family's understanding of themselves. Her signature would trigger a chain of events that would expose every secret, destroy every carefully maintained illusion. If I sign these, what happens to Miles, Evie, and Jonah? They would learn that Sebastian wasn't their biological father during the court proceedings. The DNA evidence would become public record. Miles would lose his business, Evie would lose her children's trust fund, Jonah would lose his inheritance. And they would lose their sense of identity. Probably. Eleanor's honesty was brutal but necessary. But you would gain what is legally and biologically yours. Celeste was reaching for the pen when they heard voices in the hallway outside Eleanor's office. The outer door opened and footsteps approached. Eleanor frowned, checking her watch. I didn't schedule any other appointments. The conference room door opened and Jonah appeared, his hair disheveled and his eyes carrying the wild intensity of someone who had been drinking but was desperately trying to stay focused. I knew you'd be here, he said, looking directly at Celeste. I've been watching you, Cess. The secret meetings with Eleanor, the weird questions about Dad's medical history, the way you disappear whenever we talk about the inheritance.
Celeste felt her carefully maintained composure cracking. Jonah, you shouldn't be here. No, I should be exactly here. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. Because whatever you're planning, it involves all of us, doesn't it? And I think we deserve to know what it is. Eleanor started to speak, but Jonah held up his hand. I know your dad's lawyer, and I know lawyer-client privilege means you can't tell me anything. But Cess can. His eyes, so much like Sebastian's despite sharing no DNA, found Celeste's face. What did you discover, sister? What's so important that you're willing to meet in secret about it? Celeste looked at the legal papers in front of her, then at Jonah's face, then at the letters from both her parents that revealed the scope of secrets that had shaped all their lives. Jonah, please sit down. Celeste sat in Sebastian's leather chair for another hour after finishing Alice's letter, the weight of 28 years of family deception settling into her bones like a chronic ache. The study felt different now. Not like a sanctuary, but like a museum dedicated to the complexity of love and the price of well-intentioned lies. She was still holding the letter when her phone rang, Eleanor Grant's name appearing on the screen with an urgency that made her stomach clench. Celeste, I need you to come to my office immediately.
Eleanor's voice was tight with controlled panic. Miles has filed incorporation papers for a business restructure. If we're going to challenge the will, we have 48 hours before the window closes entirely. The words hit Celeste like cold water. What does that mean exactly? It means he's moving Sebastian's assets into a new corporate structure that would make any legal challenge exponentially more complex and public. Right now, contesting the will would be a private family matter handled through probate court. After this restructure, it becomes a corporate lawsuit that would involve business partners, creditors, and public filings. Celeste looked around the study where she'd just discovered the final piece of her family's puzzle. I'll be there in 30 minutes. The drive to Eleanor's office felt like traveling toward her own execution. Portland's evening traffic moved with typical sluggishness, giving her too much time to think about what she was about to decide. Alice's letter was folded in her purse, its revelation still reverberating through her understanding of everything she'd believed about her parents' relationship. Eleanor's office building was mostly empty at 7 p.m., fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows in the marble lobby. When Celeste reached the 23rd floor, she found Eleanor pacing behind her desk, legal documents spread across every available surface. "I've pulled everything together," Eleanor said without preamble, gesturing to stacks of papers. DNA results, medical records, Alice's correspondence, Sebastian's fertility treatments, everything needed to prove you're his biological heir and that Miles, Evie, and Jonah have no genetic claim to the estate. Celeste settled into the familiar chair across from Eleanor's desk, but this time the mahogany surface between them felt like an altar where she was about to sacrifice either her principles or her future. "There's something else you need to know," Eleanor continued, pulling out a thick folder. "I found this in Sebastian's safe deposit box when settling the estate. It's a letter he wrote but never sent, addressed to you." Celeste's heart hammered as she accepted another envelope, another secret from beyond the grave. Sebastian's handwriting was shakier than Alice's, evidence of the blood pressure issues that had plagued his final years. "Dear Celeste, I know I have not been the father to you that I was to Miles, Evie, and Jonah. And I know you've felt that difference. You're too intelligent and too kind to ever say so, but I see the hurt in your eyes when I favor them unconsciously. I want you to understand that my distance comes from fear, not lack of love. When Alice and I began our relationship, I was a broken man who had failed at everything that mattered. Marriage, fatherhood, providing the family Lily deserved. You represented a second chance, but also a reminder of my moral failure. Every time I looked at you, I saw both my greatest joy and my deepest shame. I held back my love because I was afraid of seeming to replace Lily's children with Alice's daughter. I was afraid they would feel abandoned if they saw me loving you the way I wanted to. So I tried to love you all equally, which meant loving none of you completely. This was wrong. You deserved better. You deserved a father who could see you for who you are rather than what you represented. You're the kindest, most thoughtful of all my children, and I failed you by not recognizing that sooner. I hope someday you can forgive an old man's mistakes." Celeste looked up at Eleanor, tears blurring her vision. "When did he write this?" 6 months before he died. I think he was planning to give it to you, but..." Eleanor's voice trailed off. "But he never found the courage." Celeste folded the letter carefully, adding it to the growing collection of unsent confessions from her parents, just like Alice never found the courage to tell him I was his biological daughter. Eleanor opened her briefcase and pulled out the legal documents that would change everything. The challenge papers. All they need is your signature and they'll be filed within the hour. Miles would receive notice tomorrow morning that his inheritance is being contested. The words hit Celeste like cold water. What does that mean exactly?
Celeste stared at the papers, black ink on white paper that represented the power to reshape her entire family's understanding of themselves. Her signature would trigger a chain of events that would expose every secret, destroy every carefully maintained illusion. If I sign these, what happens to Miles, Evie, and Jonah? They would learn that Sebastian wasn't their biological father during the court proceedings. The DNA evidence would become public record. Miles would lose the business, Evie would lose her children's trust fund, Jonah would lose his inheritance. And they would lose their sense of identity. Probably.
Eleanor's honesty was brutal but necessary. But you would gain what is legally and biologically yours. Celeste was reaching for the pen when they heard voices in the hallway outside Eleanor's office. The outer door opened and footsteps approached. Eleanor frowned, checking her watch. I didn't schedule any other appointments. The conference room door opened, and Jonah appeared, his hair disheveled and his eyes carrying the wild intensity of someone who'd been drinking but was desperately trying to stay focused. I knew you'd be here, he said, looking directly at Celeste. I've been watching you, Cess. The secret meetings with Eleanor, the weird questions about Dad's medical history, the way you disappear whenever we talk about the inheritance. Celeste felt her carefully maintained composure cracking. Jonah, you shouldn't be here. No, I should be exactly here. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. Because whatever you're planning, it involves all of us, doesn't it? And I think we deserve to know what it is. Eleanor started to speak, but Jonah held up his hand. I know your dad's lawyer, and I know lawyer-client privilege means you can't tell me anything. But Cess can. His eyes, so much like Sebastian's, despite sharing no DNA, found Celeste's face. What did you discover, sister? What's so important that you're willing to meet in secret about it? Celeste looked at the legal papers in front of her, then at Jonah's face, then at the letters from both her parents that revealed the scope of secrets that had shaped all their lives. Jonah, please sit down. Jonah's eyes darted between Celeste and the legal papers spread across Eleanor's desk, his expression shifting from suspicion to understanding to something approaching horror. The silence stretched for nearly a full minute before he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. You found something about Dad, didn't you? Something about the inheritance. Celeste looked at Eleanor, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Whatever attorney-client privilege existed, it belonged to Celeste now, and she could choose what to reveal. Jonah, if I tell you this, it will change everything you believe about our family. Everything. He settled into the chair beside her, his hands trembling slightly. I've felt like I didn't belong my entire life, Cess. If there's truth to be found, I can handle it. Celeste reached for Alice's letter first, then Sebastian's, then the DNA results. As she handed them to Jonah, she watched his face process each revelation, the affair, the fertility issues, the biological reality that made mockery of everything they believed about blood and belonging. When he finished reading, Jonah was quiet for a long time. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. Not with humor, but with the bitter recognition of cosmic irony. So, your dad's actual biological daughter, and Miles, Evie, and I are genetic strangers he raised out of the goodness of his heart. He looked up at Celeste, his eyes bright with unshed tears. And he left everything to us, while cutting out the only person who actually shares his DNA. That's the situation. Jonah gestured toward the legal papers. And those would fix it? Give you what's rightfully yours? They would contest the will. If successful, I could potentially claim the entire estate. Leaving you with nothing. Leaving you with nothing. Celeste's voice was steady, but her hand shook as she reached for the papers Eleanor had prepared. The question is whether I sign them. Jonah stood and walked to Eleanor's window, looking out at Portland's skyline. The city lights twinkled like stars fallen to earth, beautiful and distant. Do you remember when you taught me to parallel park?
That was Dad. He taught both of us. No, it was you. Dad tried, but he got frustrated when I kept hitting the cones. You took me to that empty parking lot behind the grocery store and spent 3 hours helping me practice. You were 17, had just gotten your own license, but you gave up your entire Saturday because I was too embarrassed to keep failing in front of him.
The memory came flooding back. Jonah's hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, his face flushed with teenage humiliation, her own patient voice talking him through the steps until he finally managed a perfect park. "That's what family is," Jonah continued, still facing the window. "Not DNA, not legal documents, not inheritance rights. It's choosing to spend your Saturday helping someone who's struggling, even when you don't have to." He turned back to face her, and Celeste saw something in his expression she'd never seen before. Complete clarity, unmarred by the self-doubt and addiction issues that had clouded his judgment for years. "Dad was wrong to exclude you from his will, but you'd be wrong to destroy us to fix it." Celeste looked down at the papers requiring only her signature to set everything in motion. "You're asking me to choose your financial security over my legal rights. I'm asking you to choose love over justice, the same choice Dad made every day for 28 years when he loved 3 kids who weren't his while trying to figure out how to love you too." Jonah's voice broke slightly. He failed at that second part, but he never stopped trying. Eleanor cleared her throat gently. "Celeste, I need to remind you that if you don't sign these papers tonight, the opportunity will be lost. Miles's corporate restructure will make any future challenge nearly impossible." Celeste picked up the pen, feeling its weight like a weapon in her hand. Everything she'd suffered through, feeling like an outsider, being excluded from Sebastian's will, watching her siblings inherit what should have been hers, could be corrected with her signature. But she thought about Evie's children, innocently planning college futures funded by money that wasn't legally theirs. She thought about Miles, whose entire identity was built on carrying forward Sebastian's business legacy. She thought about Jonah's song about finally feeling accepted, finally feeling like he belonged. She thought about Alice's letter, confessing decades of guilt over secrets kept to protect the people she loved. She thought about Sebastian's unfinished letter, revealing his struggle to balance fairness with affection. Most of all, she thought about Dr. Santos's question: would she pursue this revelation for justice or for the validation of belonging that no external proof could ever provide? "I can't do it," she said quietly, setting the pen down. "I can't destroy the family Dad built just to claim what biology says should be mine." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Are you certain? This decision is irreversible." Celeste looked at Jonah, who was watching her with an expression of profound gratitude mixed with something that looked like pride. "I'm certain, but I have conditions." 3 months later, Celeste stood at Sebastian's grave in Riverview Cemetery, holding a small bouquet of the daisies he'd always preferred to expensive roses. The headstone was simple granite with an inscription that read, "Sebastian Marcus Grant, beloved father. I kept your secret," she said to the stone. "All of them." The small trust fund Miles, Evie, and Jonah had established for her wasn't substantial, $50,000 managed by Eleanor, but it was enough. Enough to show she mattered, enough to acknowledge her place in the family they'd built together. More importantly, her relationships with her siblings had deepened in ways she'd never expected. Jonah called her twice a week. Their conversations ranged from his music to her work to childhood memories they were finally mature enough to understand. Evie included her in every family gathering, and Sophie and Lucas had started staying overnight at her apartment occasionally, treating her like the aunt she'd always been, but hadn't always felt like. Even Miles had softened, offering her a position at Grant & Associates that came with genuine respect rather than charity. She'd declined, preferring to build her own legacy in social work, but the offer had meant everything. "I chose love," she told Sebastian's headstone. "I hope that's what you would have wanted." A light rain began to fall, and Celeste turned to leave. As she walked back to her car, she realized that the belonging she'd searched for through DNA tests and legal documents had been there all along, built not through blood or inheritance, but through 28 years of shared memories, mutual care, and the conscious choice to remain family, despite everything that tried to tear them apart. She had found her place not by claiming her biological rights, but by choosing to protect the people she loved, even when it cost her everything she thought she deserved.
That, she realized, was what Sebastian was trying to teach her all along.